The New Zealand Herald and its publisher NZME hit a nerve last week, publishing an advertisement from Hobson's pledge that critics have called misleading, factually incorrect and racist. The full front-page rap urges readers to sign a petition to, quote, restore the foreshore and seabed to public ownership.
Not only disappointed for our people, I'm disappointed for all of those journalists that do work with NZME, that do work for the New Zealand Herald, who probably looked at this and thought, what the heck is going on?
It prompted a call-out from the Māori Journalists Association, Kawea Te Rongo, a boycott from Te Pāti Māori, iwi Radio severing its ties, and an open letter signed by 170 lawyers refuting the ad's claims. Plans for a second ad were scrapped by NZME, who promised a review into its advertising policies, sparking more fury from Hobson's pledge spokesman Don Brash and the Free Speech Union. But was the outcry justified?
Given the temperature of the country in this year, it was really an irresponsible thing to do.
I'm Tu Whenua o Ngā Tanahira, and today on The Detail, I take a look at the claims published. What's the truth, what's a blurring of the truth, and what's a lie? Plus, how do editorial decisions like this affect the journalists who work for the media companies publishing these claims? Here's former editor-in-chief of the Herald, Tim Murphy.
This sort of advertising borrows the kind of imprimatur, the backing of a masthead. So this New Zealand Herald has gone out there for this long, presenting news, either to people's taste or not, but it presents it and people give it extra credibility, and its front page has a particular standing. I've written a piece in which I suggest that the front page of the Herald putting something like this on would be like TVNZ turning over Simon Dello at the beginning of its bulletin to read out a political message or to read out an advocacy advertisement like this is. That's the kind of thing that we wouldn't do there and no one would expect. And the front page of the paper carries some of that same standing and reputation, which, given the time of sensitivity and those two things clashing, lead to what is just this almighty, for media terms, controversy.
We'll come back to Tim, but first, let's look at the ad itself. At the centre of it is a claim that there are applications from iwi, hapu and whānau for customary marine titles of nearly all the New Zealand coastline under MACA, the Marine and Coastal Areas Act. That part is true. But what is not true is that those titles would limit public access to the beaches. Customary marine titles are just about commercial use. Natalie Coates is the tumuaki wahine for the Māori Law Society, Te Hungaroa Māori o Aotearoa. She was one of 170 lawyers who penned an open letter laying out why the ad was wrong and racist.
I think it's helpful to go through line by line, but also overall it's important to make sure you look at the ad in its whole and its entirety and how it creates an impression.
We'll begin with the line by line, starting with the title. Restore the foreshore and seabed to public ownership. Public ownership is highlighted in red.
So restore the foreshore and seabed to public ownership. Well, the foreshore and seabed has never historically been in public ownership. So it's not owned by anybody currently, except for the areas of foreshore that are currently in mainly non-Māori private ownership, actually. So the status quo is that it's not owned by anyone, and the historical position has also been that it's not a public thing that is owned. So the idea of that restoration is sort of a false.
Here's another line. Customary marine titles give iwi the right of veto over all resource consents and conservation activities, involvement in coastal planning and policy development, the ability to charge commercial operators, restrict public access to wāhi tapu and rāhui, and ownership rights to all non-nationalised minerals, including royalties from the existing mining operations, backdated to when the application was first submitted. That seems to come into conflict with the court order you've just told me.
So you kind of need to look at the front page and then look at the second page. So if we look at the front page, so you've got restore the foreshore and seabed to public ownership, and then you've got a line in there that says almost New Zealand's entire coast is under application before the courts to be awarded to iwi as customary marine titles. What I think the important part when you're pairing those two particular things is that the impression that you get when you're reading Restore Public Ownership and iwi are going to get title is that Māori will come to own this area. And I think in terms of that, like if you hear that simplistic message, restore to public ownership and iwi are going to get title, you don't understand the actual nuances of what that means, i.e. when people think of ownership and title, you think of a particular type of inability to go to a place. You think of the ability to exclude people and all of those sorts of things. And I think the impression that creates is an incorrect one, because Māori, under this framework, their rights are funneled into very specific rights. And so and in fact, what the legislation did was extinguish those rights. So again, it's kind of like you can pick out these little bits and pieces and lines, but you need to sort of be careful how you look at those and you interpret those as a whole, because I think the layeredness of how that ad presents itself is the thing to really focus on. In terms of what you were just sort of talking about around what rights a customary marine title does give, it's really important to understand that it doesn't give them, Māori, iwi, hapu, the right to exclude people from that area. So in the ad, it's got a big sign that says beach closed, or a big picture that says beach closed in red, dripping blood red. And then it also talks about everyone having the same right to visit a public beach, swim and fish in its waters, and enjoy your environment. Everyone has all of those rights. You have the right to fish. You have the right to access. You have the right to navigate in that space.
Taking a step back from the actual ad itself, I'd like to talk about the ideas that is within them. And I'm wondering where these ideas of, Māori having rights over parts of the moana and them and those rights come into conflict with, public access, public ownership. Where did they come from, and do they have any legal standing at all?
Yes. So, like on land, Māori have long held rights based on tikanga, based on occupation, based on usage from when they first arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so those rights date back to that original occupation. So if you think of, iwi, particularly those that live coastally, they had rights on their land, and the moana was their front garden. So rights date back to then. Then what happened was that the English legal system was brought over from England and implanted onto our whenua. And that legal system also recognised the existing rights of Indigenous peoples. So those rights were carried through under the common law and could be recognised. And that all came to a head in 2003, if you'll remember, with that Court of Appeal case, where the court held that Māori could go to court and prove those rights through court. And that's when the foreshore and seabed came in. So Māori have long held rights recognised in this space. But in that 2003 Court of Appeal case that said they can go ahead, the backlash that came from that was the Foreshore and Seabed Act, because of the fear-mongering that was taking place, really, I think, at the time, around what that would mean for the ordinary Kiwi going to the beach. So what we then did when we later replaced the Foreshore and Seabed Act was we, again, guaranteed those rights of public access, navigation and fishing. Those rights were all preserved, and then Māori rights were effectively all extinguished and funneled into this very narrow, limited legislative scheme where we have to prove these threshold tests. And we're currently going through that process. The issue that we're facing now, though, is again an attempt by the government to limit those rights, to change the threshold tests, to read them down so that they're over a lesser area. And we're getting the campaign that we're now seeing playing itself out as well to peer that, to peer that, and again to fearmonger about what these rights actually mean and the bite that they will have and effect that they will have if they're awarded.
I wonder if we can take a step back to the raru that came from that initial foreshore and seabed raru, and could you just describe to me what it was like back then in terms of the rhetoric that was being used within the media, within campaigns like this one, and if there are any similarities with the campaign that we see today? I mean, what is the ad? Are we looking back in time?
It feels very much like that. I mean, for all of those who who can remember, if I cast my mind back, I was a budding young law student at the time, sort of just going into law school. But I recall at the time there was very much those iwi not Kiwi type messages. The "we are all New Zealanders." There was the fear-mongering really around what Māori rights in this space would actually mean, and of course there was the public reaction to that, and the law that was eventually passed, and of course the way that Māori saw that was a really just kickback against long-held rights that they were finally trying to have sought be recognised, and they saw it as really what was a mass confiscation of their rights and interest in this space, because it just wiped them all out. It just said the Crown owns it, and here's kind of a way to try and recognise it, but here's these really strict tests that you need to meet to be able to do so. And I guess the messaging that we're getting is just a repeat of the same old ads. Like, I remember opening it up, the Hobson's Pledge ad that we saw recently, and that could have been effectively the tone and tenor of it was a copy and paste from the 20 years ago playbook.
Natalie says it raises questions around the media's role in responsible reporting.
What are the standards that the media is holding itself to when grappling with these really racially divisive and in this case we'd say factually incorrect and deceptive type of propaganda that's being presented? What is the line there? What's lawful? What's not? What's upholding correct standards of truth and what's not? So that's sort of a separate question to what, if I'm wearing my pōtai as tumuaki of the Māori Law Society, there's a separate question around everybody getting accurate information to what's going on here. What is our history around these, the extinguishment of Māori rights in this space? What are Māori actually getting? What is the tough process to go through and have any form of limited rights recognised? What have Māori already lost in this process, right? There's a whole kind of narrative there, and there's a whole I think it's really important to have a full and accurate picture of what's going on in the space, i.e., is it a bad thing that Māori have long-held rights and interests that are recognised in a really limited form, whilst the public have their rights, guaranteed, like their access and all of those sorts of things guaranteed? What sort of country do we want to be? Do we want to be a country that extinguishes and minimises these rights such that they're kind of nothing? There are bigger questions going on that also plays into the current reform of the Crown.
Tim Murphy is the co-editor of Newsroom. He was previously editor-in-chief at the New Zealand Herald, where he worked for decades. He says the business side of the company and the newsroom are quite distinct.
So you have the people who are on the business or commercial side who will sell and bring in the revenue, the money from advertisers. Their interests are getting their advertisers' messages into the best positions and the best places and the most prominent spots in the paper. And the editorial team, which looks after news and journalism, and the editor runs them. Classically, the front page was almost all turned over to stories and journalism. Progressively over many years, small advertising has been allowed in different parts of the paper. And in the last about decade and a half, the idea of selling the entire front page of newspapers and wrapping around the section and selling sections and sequences of front pages have come in, and that has been under the advertising department. But for that to have been approved then and even now, the people who run the actual business, the chief executive and the head of publishing, who sit above both the advertising and the editorial or the editor, are the people who would make the big decisions.
Ultimately, the buck stops with the CEO and the head of publishing there. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be the case. And my pick, I haven't spoken to my successor. I was editor at the Herald for 14 years, but I haven't spoken directly to my successor or other editors directly. I don't think that would be fair on them. What I can say is that I would be very surprised if the editorial part of the Herald, the journalists, the editor, hadn't raised questions about running the Hobson's Pledge advertisement on the front page in the form it's in. I would expect that they would have questioned it to the advertising department, and it may well have been that without a resolution between the two of them, someone higher up the chain would have said, no, the money is good. Strictly on the Advertising Standards Authority, which kind of is a volunteer regulator of ads and you can complain to, strictly it may well have met the criteria that they set. But that, in my mind, and I'm sure in the journalists at the Herald's mind, didn't encompass all that this represented to their readership.
If you were still at the Herald and you saw that ad, what would your reaction be? Would you want it run the next day?
No, I wouldn't have wanted it run, and I don't think it would have run then. I think the situation media companies find themselves in with their revenues suffering in this economy might well have been part of a sort of motivation to bring in what could have been, say, $25,000 or so into the newspaper. I wouldn't have wanted it run. I don't think it looks exactly or that similar to a New Zealand Herald piece of journalism, actually. But I think because it rides under that big H, the Gothic H in the New Zealand Herald masthead, that it gets a kind of informal and borrows a sort of informal stamp of approval that the Herald is putting this before you on its front page so that you can't miss it. So that's a message that we're putting out there. It wasn't the editor's message and it wasn't the journalist's message, but they have been the subject of a lot of criticism, probably unfounded, but it speaks to some organisational and business issues, I think.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that actually. So I'd like to know how advertisements like this affect the staff, so the journalists. So we've already seen some blowback almost immediately, Te Pāti Māori in particular, saying that they would boycott NZME journalists. You spent some time in the gallery. What kind of blowback do these kind of things have for the individual journalists?
Oh, they're really uncomfortable situations because the main reason why this ought not to have run, there are two in my view. One is that it made incorrect claims, so it was an error and therefore could be said to mislead on purpose. But the other reason, more for media and for journalists, is that it cuts right across what the Herald's journalists and journalism is trying to do on issues that are controversial maybe, are contentious. Their journalists and the stories that they'd publish on that very space on other days need to be seen to be above any kind of pressure from a lobby group or commercial pressure. So I think for the journalists it's acutely uncomfortable. The political journalists, you've mentioned Te Pāti Māori and Willie Jackson from Labour and others have been very strong, but also with journalists in general, Māori journalists obviously, others who just consider that their ability to cover and present on issues like this gets just sidelined or overrun a bit by these messages that are going out commercially. So I think that's really, really uncomfortable for some of them.
So Kawe Te Rongo, that's the Māori Journalists Association, they came out staunchly straight away and said, we're looking for NZME and the Herald to make, number one, a public apology, but also an apology to their staff. Do you think that is something that is, do you think, number one, it's appropriate? And number two, do you think it's something that's possible? Do you think the Herald would make a move like that?
Oh, I think an apology in the form of an editorial, so clearly from the editor and the editorial department, that could, in my view, would be a good move to put it on the front page, could apologise for the incorrect nature of what was presented. I don't know whether an apology to staff would be expected because the staff will understand that the editor and the journalists who make decisions weren't making that particular decision. But it could well be that the business side and the CEO might want to address his own staff and say, well, look, we put you in an invidious position, yes. I think the apology ought to just accentuate that the Herald seeks to cover these things as journalists in a wide, broad and open way, that they don't want their journalism and don't believe their journalism is commercially compromised but that care needs to be taken to stop that kind of impression. And also that they respect all sensitivities of all their communities here in Aotearoa. And so I think some sort of statement that addresses some of that and yes, apologises for the misstatements and for the offence that those misstatements might have contained would be appropriate. Whether it happens, probably if it was up to an editor, they might well consider that the best approach. Whether they've got the leeway from the commercial side again, and those who make the decisions on the PR for the business, in my view, it would be good for their business to come back from this and acknowledge, but not sure that can happen.
Just taking a little bit of a step back and looking at the ad, and in particular, it's the time in which it was published. So I don't think it's a secret that there's a lot of angst among Māori communities at the moment, particularly around decisions by the government, whether it be the removal of Section 7AA. Most recently, of course, more amendments to MACA, the Marine and Coastal Act, just to name a few. Or, of course, there's been some discussion around rhetoric and the use of te reo Māori in the public space. And so when you look at the timing at which this ad has been placed, do you think that has added to some of the, I suppose, anger that it has drummed up, just in terms of where it has been placed?
Oh, completely. You'd have to have rocks in your head within the organisation approving that ad to not think the sensitivities are acute for Māori and for many others at the moment, with multiple reforms, changes, repeals, reversions being sought by the various coalition parties. There's real sensitivity, and that there, especially because on this Marine and Coastal Areas Act, some of the claims being made aren't right. Don Brash, whose Hobson's pledge was behind it, has come out saying repeatedly, well, show us what's wrong. What are you claiming is wrong? And as you know, the Māori lawyers group answered that with at least 170 when I was counting, but it may well be higher, lawyers and legal experts saying, well, here are 4 or 5 things that are specifically in error that aren't right. And the main one is the very headline of this ad, which says, restore the foreshore and seabed to public ownership, when in fact that wasn't its original state. It was never considered or ought to have been public ownership as the consideration, which is what the court found critically. Helen Clark took a law to try and create Crown ownership, and then the original now MACA bill from 2011 changed that and put it aside and said, well, no one owns it, but Māori have the right to assert customary rights where they can show them given the circumstances. So that main claim of restoring it to public ownership actually is restoring to when and where. And I think it's a very good point made by the Māori Lawyers Group, but it was the first thing that struck me, having read some of those court decisions on the MACA.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Thank you to Natalie Coates and Tim Murphy. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Gwen McClure and Davina Zimmer. I'm Tūwhenua Roa Ngā Tanahira, ka kite anō.